So let's talk about the role of risk management in information security. And let's start off by defining risk. So, what is risk? Let's break it down to a pretty simple definition. And risk is simply the chance of something unwanted happening. So, that's a pretty simple explanation of what risk is. And the key word here that we're looking at is chance. So when it comes to risk management, we want to minimize the chance. That's what we're doing when we minimize risk. We're minimizing the chance that something unwanted will happen. And that's what risk management is all about, because there's lots of unwanted things that could happen out there, and we want to manage those. So let's start talking about risk management and how we go about reducing risk. And there's 5 things we're going to talk about here. The first one is identify risk. Because if we don't know that it exists, then we're not going to be able to manage it. And so that's number 1. We have to identify what risk exists in our environment. Then we need to, number 2, define the probability that that unwanted situation or incident will happen. So we're talking about define probability. So, for example, what's the probability that someone will click on a link to something that has a malicious payload in it, and it will go down and infect their machine? So what is the probability that that will happen? Well, if we do nothing about it, the probability is going to be high, because our folks out there on the front lines dealing with emails and phishing emails and farming sites and all these different things, well, they're going to fall prey to this if we don't do something to help protect our environment and our business and organization and our personnel from this. So we have to define a probability. So if we do nothing, the probability of this scenario would be pretty high. But if we do things like provide security awareness training, and we use web content filtering and phishing email filtering, then we can take that from a high to a low level that will happen. And that just depends on how much effort we put into it when performing our risk management for that specific scenario. So, number 3, we need to define the potential impact. And what we're talking about is the impact of the risk if it were to be realized. So, if it was to happen, what would be the impact to our organization? We need you to define that, because that's actually going to carry with it weight. It's going to make this risk even worse if it was to be realized. So then, number 4, we need to decide how are we going to handle the risk. Because there's several different things that we can do to handle risk, and there's different ways to approach it, and we're going to get into that a little later on. But we got to figure out, what are we going to do about this risk? And then lastly, we need to monitor the risk. Because we need to collect metrics, we need to find out when we decide how we're going to handle this with our metrics, we can say, yeah, what we're doing is working great. Or we could say, you know what? Our risk is being realized way too often. We need to go back and revisit how we're going to handle the risk that we've identified. All right, moving on. Understanding risk. So this allows managers to assign resources efficiently, because we've got our resources out there, and we need to be good stewards of those resources, because we know our resources are finite. We don't have unlimited resources. So it's good that we understand what that risk is, what impact it has on the organization, how likely it is to be realized, or the probability, and then we're going to decide how to handle that risk. So understanding risk is key when it comes to making good judgment calls and assigning our finite resources to a specific risk. All right, so risk management dependencies. Let's talk about some of these. And there's really 2 primary factors here. Number 1 is going to be executive management support. So again, we've talked about this before. It has to come from the top. And that's how risk management is. Okay. Also, number 2, it needs to be part of the organizational culture. And yes, we're back to culture again. So from the top and culture, we're going to hear that over and over and over again within information security, because it's so true. This carries so much weight as to what will happen with our efforts. And it's efforts for general information security, it's efforts for risk management, it's efforts for all kinds of things. But these two right here greatly influence the effectiveness of our efforts. So now let's talk about some risk management programs and what they provide. And really, there's four things here that they provide with a risk management program. Number one, a greater understanding of technology in the organization. And that's because as we go through and talk about risk, we're going to be talking about risk about system A or process B or revenue stream C, all these things. We're going to be talking about these. And as we dive into the revenue streams that are attached to processes, that are attached to services and servers and applications and such, we're really going to be looking at the technology for these risks so that we can see, well, what technology can we use to help address this risk? Okay, and that's part of a risk management program outcome. Another outcome is number two here, and that is a lower probability of security incidents. And that's because we're focusing on risk. And risk comes in all shapes and forms and sizes and factors and all kinds of things. And as we look to reduce risk, that's going to have a trickle-down effect and lower the probability of security incidents because of the controls we're putting in place to address risk. And next up, number three, is readiness to respond to an incident. And that's because we're going to identify that with risk, we need to be able to respond to that risk. So if that situation is realized and it does come to fruition, that we have the folks who are trained and in place and ready to respond to an incident and reduce its impact to the organization. And then lastly, number four is a greater understanding and awareness of risk. So these are four key things that will come out of a risk management program. And let's just do a quick review over here. When we're talking about our risk management and reducing risk, there's 5 things that we needed to do. So let's jump back over here. And that was number 1 was identify risk. We've got to identify it or we cannot do anything about it. Then we need to define the probability that this risk will be realized. And then if it is realized, we need to define the potential impact. Once we have that data there, then we can decide how are we going to handle this risk? What are we going to do about it? And once we decide that, then we need to monitor that risk to make sure our controls that we put in place that we defined over here in number 4, that they're working. And as long as they're working, we're going to be able to manage that risk. But we have to monitor it using metrics to make sure that our risk management is being effective. Thanks for watching, and subscribe here to get the latest from CBT Nuggets. And if you're interested in IT career or learning more about IT in general, hey, swing by cbtnuggets.com and sign up for a free trial.